Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday afternoon, October 5th, and this is the Week 8 announcement for Constitutional Law, Political Science 3753 for the fall 2025 term. Okay, everybody, what we have this week is on Thursday. It's Thursday the 9th, I believe. 6, 7, 8, 9, that's right. Thursday the 9th, we're going to have Quiz 4, and we're going to ask you to look at a couple of pieces from the SCOTUS blog website. SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS blog. These go back almost 4 years, and they were published just before the oral argument in the Dobbs versus Jackson case that, as we know, eventually overturned Roe versus Wade. So, in the one article, you'll get an idea anticipating how the oral arguments were going to go, and I think the actual arguments were pretty faithful to that, as it turned out. Then you have an article that goes through the highlights of all the legal briefs that were filed, and most of them would be classified as friend of the court or amicus curiae briefs. And in a case with the stakes this high, there'll just be thousands and thousands of pages, massive volume of legal briefs to deal with. And I mentioned in my message to you that the justices depend on their clerks to help them go through all this. Now, you're responsible for the article that summarizes these briefs on either side. On Dobbs' side, the Mississippi official, and then the health clinic in Jackson, Mississippi, that was performing abortions. Okay, briefs on either side. Now, as you bring that article up, you can click on the various briefs and take a look at the briefs if you wish. But you're not responsible for that. You're responsible for the article itself. Okay, the article discussing the legal briefs and the one by Amy Howe previewing the oral arguments. Okay, so 2 articles expect 5 true false items on each for a total of 10. 24 hours to take it on Thursday, 10 minutes once you start. Okay, and that'll be quiz number 4, I believe. All right, well, we have right to privacy, the class notes for units 13 and 14 this week. Everyone, what's at stake here is the doctrine known as substantive due process. Okay, now, as I mentioned in the class notes, if it's due process, you would have thought it would be procedural. But we distinguish between procedural due process and substantive due process. Okay. A doctrine was developed and has been through the years that there are certain things a government might do that, by virtue of their substance, okay, violate people's due process rights. So we call that substantive due process. And the class notes mention originally substantive due process meant liberty of contract. That is, back before the Supreme Court changed its mind in the 1930s about the New Deal, many of those programs were struck down on the basis of violation of liberty of contract, which would be a species of substantive due process. Well, what happened was eventually substantive due process as liberty of contract went away, and then substantive due process came back as the right to privacy. Okay. Now, with regard to abortion, that was struck down. We know almost 50 years passed from Roe versus Wade in 1973 to Dobbs in 2022. Okay. Now, substantive due process as right to privacy really started, well, you could say it started with the interracial marriage cases, such as Loving versus Virginia. Okay. But in earnest, it really started with Griswold versus Connecticut, the contraception case that came a few years before Roe versus Wade. Now, in the Dobbs case, everybody make note, Justice Clarence Thomas said that he would be willing to reconsider Griswold, Obergefell, and also the sodomy decision, Lawrence versus Texas, all of which you could call substantive due process right to privacy cases. He wants to reconsider the whole substantive due process jurisprudence. No one else, none of the other 8 signed off on his opinion. So whether they will ever do that is far from clear. Okay, but Justice Thomas thinks that all that should be reconsidered, not just Roe versus Wade, but Griswold, Obergefell, and Lawrence versus Texas. Okay. Well, everyone, after Roe versus Wade, there were any number of abortion cases that we could talk about, but they've all been superseded by the Dobbs decision. Okay. The outline and the class notes for 13 mention Planned Parenthood versus Danforth in the 1970s. Okay. When you look at lecture 14, not on the outline but in the class notes, Planned Parenthood versus Casey in the 1990s. That's the one in which it was widely speculated they might overturn Roe versus Wade in whole or in part, but they decided they were going to uphold at that time the central holding of Roe versus Wade. Okay, but really, all that jurisprudence has been superseded by Dobbs, so we mainly need to look at Roe versus Wade and Dobbs versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization. Okay. There are other issues with regard to right to privacy that we go on to discuss as we go through lecture 14. The right to die issue and developments that have taken place there, not just in the United States but also in Canada, as you will notice. And of course, that becomes part of public discussion in the United States and has constitutional significance. The gay rights cases, okay, Bowers versus Hardwick, 1986, was overturned by Lawrence versus Texas, 2003, which they decided to go ahead and declare sodomy laws unconstitutional. Okay. Then in 2015, we get Obergefell versus Hodges on same-sex marriage, of course. Okay. So before Roe versus Wade, we have Griswold on contraception. We need to look at Griswold, Roe, and Dobbs, and then we need to look at those gay rights decisions, among other things. Bowers v. Hardwick, Lawrence v. Texas, Obergefell v. Hodges. Okay. All right, so that's right to privacy. Class notes for lectures 13 and 14. The quiz coming up on Thursday. 2 things for you to look at with regard to the Dobbs decision. 2 articles. 2 false items on each for a total of 10. 10 minutes to take once you begin, 24 hours on Thursday. Okay, and so we'll talk to you again in about a week. Good luck on the quiz. Any problems, questions, or issues, contact me through the inbox on the course website or through your OPSU email at david.cole@opsu.edu. Take it easy, study hard, good luck on the quiz.